So in the last lesson, we looked at the GDP, which gave us an idea of how we measure, um, productivity, wealth, income, how we compare countries to each other. So it gives us a very good idea of how we can create a standard for growth. But that's not the only measurement there is. So we want to look at some related measurements to that GDP. So probably the closest measurement to gross domestic product is gross national product. So under gross domestic product, it's the primary measure of economic growth in the U.S. since '91. It measures economic performance of a country, and it's the total market value of all final goods and services produced within a country in a given period of time. Now, GDP is the primary measurement we used since 1991. GNP was what we used up until that point. Now, it differs a little bit, so it's the total market value of all final goods and services produced by a nation's citizens in a particular way. So when we look at the difference here, GNP measures the total market value of final goods and services produced by a nation's citizens. Now, it doesn't matter where they live at that point, whereas GDP measures it within the country, and that's just it. So if a Japanese company is in the United States, it gets measured by GDP, but it would not be measured by GNP. So what they do is they take plus income earned by its citizens, including the income of those in foreign countries, minus the income of non-residents located in that nation. So if Apple was located here in the United States but did all of its production process in China, it would count towards China's gross domestic product, but not their gross national product. And GNP measures the value of production of a nation, regardless of the nation's citizens' location. So the difference here is in talking about location. GDP says everybody in the United States. GNP says everyone who's a citizen of the United States. So both are used as indicators of standard of living. The way GNP measures out is basically if you take GDP and you add that NR, which is net income receipts, and basically what that means is net income from citizens abroad. So if you take GDP and you add to it all the income from the citizens abroad, and then subtract net payment, which is non-citizens living in the United States, so that's income outflow to foreign assets, that gives you GNP. So GDP plus NR minus NP equals GNP. And so basically what we're doing is we're subtracting the income of non-citizens and we're adding the income of citizens regardless of location. So let's look at how much of a difference these two actually make, statistically speaking. So we'll look at the comparison between GDP and GNP. This is, of course, real GNP, real GDP, 69 to 2012 in billions. So the first one here is we see our gross domestic product here in blue, and then we'll see our gross national product. Notice, of course, from 69 up through really 1999 into the 21st century, these pretty much were identical to each other. The difference, of course, comes in the late part, of the last decade. We start to see this gap emerge. So there's very minute differences between the two measures, but since 2008, GNP has grown larger than GDP. And you can look at the shaded area here, and you can see where that gap starts to develop between the two. So this could be due to increased movement of production by American companies into foreign countries. When we talked about this outsourcing. And this would mean that their income would be calculated into GNP but not GDP. So the fact that manufacturing is leaving the United States and moving overseas in a lot of cases, it has an effect. It has a statistical effect. You can see it here. It causes our GDP to go down, but it increases our GNP because now that starts to create that gap between the two because those countries are still being counted towards American income. So we can also kind of look at that part in detail. So if we actually look at the net income receipts versus the net payment. So here are the net income receipts. So this is, of course, what's coming in. Then look at the net payments in terms of what's going out. So you'll notice net income receipts have always been higher than net payments. So more money is coming into the United States from its citizens than is leaving our country from non-citizens. What's important to note, of course, is right through there, that gap beginning to develop. That 2008 to the present gap. You notice how it's gotten larger. What that means is that there are an increasing number of manufacturing jobs and other types of jobs that are companies that are within the United States that are moving out of the U.S. and into other countries. but they're American citizens. And we see that, of course, with our manufacturing. The fact that our manufacturing has dropped to such a low percentage of the workforce is explaining how this is developed. So as long as the United States continues to see manufacturing jobs leaving the United States, we'll continue to see this trend of the net income receipts and net payments growing larger in the gap. And so net income receipts, remember this is net income from citizens abroad. That's our red line. Net payment is income outflow to foreign assets. That is our blue line. And there's this gap that's been created between these two over the last 8 years. So our second related measurement is net national product. It's NNP. So net national product is the total market value of all goods and services produced by residents in a country during a given time period minus depreciation. So what this is net national product. Okay, it's GNP minus depreciation. So essentially, all we've done here is we want to know what is the citizens of our country bringing in terms of income, and then subtract the depreciation from that. Remember, depreciation, this is the decrease in value of assets, the allocation of cost of assets to periods in which assets are used. And what this means, of course, is basically what we're going to do is we're going to see how much value loss we've had on our products, because that's money that's going to have to get invested to fix. So the measurement calculates the amount of GNP that must be spent on new capital goods to maintain existing physical capital stock. So this is going to give us an idea of investment. So let's look at this in here. So you'll notice our blue line here, this is net national product. And of course, GNP would be above it. And the reason why, of course, is because GNP is going to subtract depreciation. So NNP is what that looks like. Now, the difference, that green shaded area, that's depreciation. The larger that gap is, that means the more we're going to have to invest to maintain our current production status. And that's really a good important point. If that number is becoming smaller, then it's less to maintain our production. If it gets larger, then it's going to cost us more of an investment to gain production. And one of the things we talked about is it's very difficult for companies to expand while at the same time maintaining production. A lot of times they're going to have to expand, and when they do so, they're going to have to temporarily reduce production. So if the gap between NNP and GNP gets larger, companies have to spend more money on investment and less on production. And that's why that becomes important to us. The same thing here with net domestic product. It's the same measurement, except for it uses GDP minus depreciation. All four measures together are used to determine the standard of living in a nation. And importantly, all four measurements can be used to compare countries, but also to compare time periods as well. So these numbers are allowing us to look at a country-to-country comparison, but also one time period to another. So maybe the US in the 70s versus the United States today. So it allows for comparisons. So when you look at this, GDP minus depreciation is equal to net domestic product in billions. So GDP, of course, would be first, minus NDP, which is the net depreciation. And you can see the gap again. So that tells us in between how much money has to be invested in order for us to maintain current production levels. So all four measurements we see, you'll notice that all four are similar in how they operate, but each, of course, is a little different, just enough for us to use these for comparisons between countries to determine how successful they've done. I mean, if you take the GDP and you look at the United States versus, say, Russia or China, then you can start to compare who's actually better off.